somebody who grew up with Jesus, someone who lived in Nazareth, probably would have referred to him as...
What is Jesus' actual name?
The best we can do is a rough approximation. So the name in the Hebrew Bible from which Jesus' name originates is Yehoshua, which is Joshua. Now, when we get into the Greco-Roman period and into the Common Era, the period in which the New Testament is written, that name has kind of changed a little bit. And now it is this Aramaic name that was likely pronounced by a lot of people Yeshua or Yeshua. But people in Galilee pronounce things differently, and there is pretty good scholarship that indicates that they would not have pronounced the little A on the end. So whereas many people think it's Yeshua or Yeshua, they probably pronounced Yeshu. And so I think the best argument, the best closest approximation we can get right now is that somebody who grew up with Jesus, someone who lived in Nazareth, probably would have referred to him as Yeshu or Yeshu or Yeshu or something like that.
Was that a common name?
It was a very common name. And it changes because as we go into different languages, we have to transliterate. We use different ways of spelling things so that people who are native in our language and not the language the name is coming from know how to pronounce it. And so when it goes into Greek, it goes in as Jesus. And then as it gets into Latin, it's Jesus. And then it was probably pronounced around the time the King James Version was translated, probably something like Jesus. And then the I pronunciation gave way to this J letter, and now we pronounce Jesus.
Did he have any brothers or sisters? Was he married?
Regarding marriage, the text, oddly, we would expect it to say something if he weren't married, and we'd also expect it to say something if he were married, based on the nature of the text, and it doesn't really say anything either way. And so, yeah, we don't know for sure. I would say I personally, probably 55% to 45% think he probably would have been married. But at the same time, there are some parts of the Gospels that seem to prioritize celibacy. And so maybe Jesus was like Paul. Maybe Jesus was a celibate who swore off women and sexuality entirely. We don't know. And yes, the indications are that Jesus had brothers and sisters. The texts indicate that, and then Josephus refers to Jesus as the brother of this one James.
Are there any indications in any other kind of historical literature that mention him? Or is that too early for that time? You know, like I can think of, the example that I always think of is like, okay, back in the 1500s or whatever, if there was a huge volcanic eruption in India or wherever, somebody somewhere else may have also mentioned like, hey, we saw these ash clouds in the sky. So is there any corroboration, I guess, of, I'll use dramatic language, how big of a deal he was in any other kind of texts?
There's nothing that's directly contemporaneous with his life. The closest we get to an outside attestation of Jesus is probably Josephus, who is a Jewish writer writing for a Roman audience at the very end of the 1st century CE. And he has two references to Jesus. And one of them has been significantly altered by later Christian writers, where it's like praising Jesus as the Messiah. And that's very clearly a corrupted text. But most scholars agree that it is probably expanding on an original reference to Jesus, who people called the Messiah. It doesn't really tell us much, except to say that he had a following, and the following is still around. So most of the corroborating data is going to come from 60 to 100 years after Jesus' life, and really all it attests to is how quickly Christianity spread around the Roman Empire, how early Christians seem to have worshipped. So we have this letter from a guy named Pliny, who's writing home to Roman leadership saying, hey, we found these Christians. I don't really know what to do with them. Do I kill them? Do I just beat them a little bit and let them go? What kind of crime is Christianity? And we have the response saying, just smack them around a little bit, tell them that they're not allowed to, they've got to worship the state gods and stuff like that, and then let them go. And if they do it again, then you've got to put him to death. But Pliny describes Christians gathering in the morning and singing hymns to Jesus as if to a god. So we can get a bit of a witness to how early Christianity was spreading and how it was functioning. But in terms of Jesus himself, there's not really anything that's close to contemporary with his life.
Is that odd, though?
Not really. This time and this place, we don't really have a ton of data. We don't have a ton of texts. The destruction of Jerusalem, for one, around 70 CE, between 68 and 70 CE, destroyed a lot of records, and people ran off and were in hiding for a long time. But we just don't have much to cover that period and that place anyway. There's a Jewish author named Philo, and then Josephus are really our main sources of history for Judea in the first century. Philo is roughly contemporaneous with Jesus and Paul, and then Josephus is coming decades after. But if we did not have those two authors, we would know next to nothing about the history of this period. So no, it's not incredibly unusual. People try to paint it as if this guy was real, we would know about it. We would have records. We would have, the Roman records of crucifixion and stuff like that. And that's just not true.